Okay, welcome everyone to the Econ Playground. I'm very happy to be here with Dylan Pahman. Dylan is a research fellow at the Acton Institute, and he's the executive editor of the Journal of Markets and Morality. Him and I met a couple years ago at Acton University, I believe, which is a great event that everyone interested in faith and classical liberalism should take a look at. And yeah, so thanks, Dylan, for being on.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Marcus.
Yeah, so the thing that we want to talk about today is a project that Dylan's been working on for a while now, and I think we're hopefully going to be seeing pretty soon. I think you're approaching the final stages, which is a book largely on what you might call Orthodox social thought. And so a lot of
Yes.
people have maybe heard of Catholic social thought or Catholic social teaching or something like that as sort of a rough summary of a lot of different Catholic ideas relating to politics, law, economics, the way that people interact with one another, that's sort of been accumulating over the last 150 years. But what exactly is Orthodox social thought, and how exactly would you distinguish it from Catholic social thought? And if you don't want to be too negative in your definition, you could give a more
Yeah.
positive definition of
No,
Orthodox.
that's a great question. So I think it's actually best to start with what is modern Christian social thought.
Okay.
Because social thought sometimes sounds like, oh, culture war sort of stuff, and that's not really what it's about. Sometimes it'll interact with those issues, but that's kind of secondary. Um, Christian social thought comes from what in the 19th century was called the social question. It was the problem of the working poor in the new industrial economies. So there was all this increased production, and people started to see this rise of well-being and abundance, and yet there were some really harsh conditions, especially for the people who were doing the producing. And so Christian theologians, pastors, decided that they couldn't remain silent and that kind of the old tools weren't quite sufficient. So, if you look at someone who actually is far more interesting than you might think, but the Christian socialist F.D. Morris, he basically conceives of society in terms of church, state, and family. Right? He
Hmm.
doesn't really have a separate category for the economy. Right? Even though he's still trying to, help out these worker cooperatives and that kind of thing. It was actually a non-political movement. It's not about class struggle or anything like that. But he doesn't quite have even the theoretical categories for even understanding the world as he lives in it. So then pretty soon you get people like Pope Leo the 13th or Abraham Kuyper among Protestants and others who kind of start playing with it a bit. Maybe society is a bunch of spheres, right? And there's business and there's labor and there's, education and all that sort of thing. Or you have people like Dietrich Bonhoeffer who just adds to church, state, and family work, right? And that's kind of his way of dealing with it. So it comes out of that, and there's a lot more to it. But you get that kind of beginning of modern Christian social thought maybe in like 1891 with Pope Leo the 13th's encyclical Rerum Novarum. And so the question I've had, so I've been here at Acton for 14 years now, and I've been editing this journal, 2 issues a year for 14 years. So that's a lot. I've been reading a lot, and most of it has been either Catholic or Protestant. And that's fine. I've learned a lot. But I'm Greek Orthodox, and I kept wondering to myself, well, how do we do this, right? Like, what's our approach to this? I think there's a lot of common ground between traditions, things like natural law, for example. You might find one or two more contemporary Orthodox theologians saying that's a Western thing, but just put simply, they're wrong. Like the historical record, literally every single century I can find you an Orthodox theologian who presumes that sin is against nature and virtue is according to nature, and I can go on and on about that sort of thing. But it's really a very common Christian thing going all the way back to the New Testament. So there's common ground like that. Like I said, that idea of church, state, and family, that is a common thing you can find even in the catechetical literature of the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. When they talk about honor your father and mother, they say, well, there's other authorities too. There's church authorities and there's state authorities. So you kind of have these three realms. But we have our own unique contribution. So some of it, I think, when I look at the Roman Catholic tradition, as much as I think natural law is excellent and it's a great foundation for public morality and public engagement, there's not anything that's actually uniquely Christian about it. So the Stoics had natural law, and Aristotle had natural law, and there are Christian versions of it, but a lot of Catholic social teaching tends to kind of stay at that level of natural law, and I think it's very insightful for that. But it kind of, one of the complaints I would have is it doesn't get enough at, well, yeah, but what about the gospel? What about Christ, right? That's a generalization. If there's any Catholic listeners, I'm sure, it's somewhat unfair. But that is something that I kind of notice. The other one is, Catholics are big on virtue ethics, again, coming from this natural law foundation. I think rightly so. Virtue is what we need to be the people we're supposed to be, to act in the way we're supposed to act, right? It's this kind of internal disposition, this second nature that we cultivate. But there's very little, in fact, only a few passing references. And I've surveyed several of the encyclicals in the Catholic tradition to asceticism. Literally the practices by which we gain virtue and become virtuous. So there's this big gaping hole, and it's true of Protestant social thought as well, that they really don't engage the ascetic side of Christian morality. And so to me, this actually solves some of the puzzles. So one aspect that I think should be at the forefront, and it's in my forthcoming book, which I've sent you a few chapters, and you gave me some very helpful comments on those, and we're going to discuss those in a minute. But I have a book coming out by Ancient Faith Publishing called The Kingdom of God and the Common Good. Should be this November. We'll see, but that's the estimated release date at this point. And so I talk about asceticism. So what is Christian asceticism? What is Orthodox asceticism? It's not like, flailing ourselves with whips like the monk in the Da Vinci Code or whatever. It's not this kind of Gnostic rejection of the material world. What it is trying to discipline our desires, right, and our passions, so that they can be used for greater good, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's self-denial, but not for the sake of the denial, if that makes sense. So we're in Lent right now as we record this, and we fast. We don't eat a lot of foods. But the whole point is we're preparing for a feast, right? The feast of all feasts. We're preparing for Pascha, for Easter. And when it comes, it's always been just so much brighter for the fast that came before it. So that's kind of the idea. Theologically, I think the pattern is Christ's death and resurrection, right? St. Paul tells us to put to death our passions and our members on the earth, and then to be raised up, through the church, through baptism, but also, through asceticism. We're dying and rising with Christ daily. So that's kind of the personal side of asceticism. The social side is that we actually can't have healthy relationships without it. There actually even is, to give some credit to the more natural law emphasis of our Roman Catholic friends. If I want to have a relationship with you, I need to shut up. I mean, right now you're interviewing me, so I'm going to be talking a lot, but I need to stop talking and I need to listen to you, right? That's how I learn who you are. That's how I share your life, and share my life with you, is when you listen. I need to share space. I need to share time. I need to share meals even, right? Like all this sort of stuff, all the things, all these little practices, whether it's, silence, solitude, fasting, all of that, they actually have a social context as well. I'm fond of the beginning of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. It has one of the greatest opening lines in all of literature, which is that happy families are all alike, but unhappy families are unhappy in their own way. And I think that happy families are all alike because they're all ascetic, right? The parents and the children pray together. They eat at set times. They have dietary rules like eat your dinner and then you can have dessert. It's not quite fasting, but it is discipline, right?
And maybe in a broader way, just that they're willing to give up something for the sake of the family. That each member of the family doesn't think of themselves as an autonomous unit that just operates according to their rule. And if we're lucky, we're all moving in the same direction, right? You give up something for the purpose of the others in the family in particular.
Yes. And without that, you have dysfunctional families, right? If everybody's just trying to assert their own will over everyone else, that's when things go wrong, right? So that's a huge part of it. just as big, if not bigger part, is the idea of Catholicity. And this is something that maybe is kind of more of an Orthodox analog to the idea of solidarity in the Roman Catholic tradition. But the basic idea that comes from, or I draw it from, St. Ignatius of Antioch. St. Ignatius was, I believe, third bishop of Antioch. So, Peter was the first, and there's someone else, and there's Ignatius. Ignatius knew St. John, the evangelist. He was martyred in 110 AD in a Roman Colosseum by wild animals, and he wrote 7 letters on his road to martyrdom. And one of the letters, he's talking about the Gnostics, and he's talking about how, Orthodox Christians are different from them. And he's warning I believe it's the Magnesians, he's warning them not to listen to those teachers. And what does he say? Well, he says, they have no love for orphans and widows. They don't care for the oppressed. And he keeps going. He says they deny that the Eucharist is the body and blood of Christ. They deny the resurrection and the incarnation. And then almost right afterwards, he says, by contrast, you should always come together under your bishop. For where the bishop is, there is Jesus Christ. And where Jesus Christ is, there is the Catholic Church. The word Catholic in Greek is katholikon. It comes from 2 words. It means, let's see here, kath means through, and olos means the whole. So it's more like the holistic church, right? Yeah. So in Christ, in the gospel, we have God and man, heaven and earth being brought together, and universally, ancient Christians, Orthodox Christians, understood this also to bridge the gap between rich and poor, right? That if we believe in the incarnation, if we believe in the resurrection, if we believe in the reality of the sacraments, if we submit to the hierarchy of the church, we also need to be caring for the poor. And in fact, one of the key functions of the bishop in the ancient church was defender of the weak, was distributor of alms, right? So this was from the very beginning part of the ethos of the ancient church, and it was linked into who Christ is and who we are in him. So that's a very long answer, but those are the 2 maybe major foci, and I could go into other ones as well. But those are recurring definitely in every almost every chapter, that it comes up again and again in different ways. And it's something that I really think is a genuine contribution of our Orthodox tradition that really adds to the broader Christian conversation of what do we do about, we live in this world of abundance, but we still have poverty, and how do we go about that in a way that doesn't cast aside our tradition, saying, well, that's all outdated now, we got to figure out something new, but instead applies it to this new context.
Now, so someone might hear what you say about asceticism and then say, okay, so what Dylan is telling me is that in a country or in a place that takes Orthodox social thought seriously, there might be laws, mandating certain fast days, or there might be other restrictions or requirements to go to church or something like that. I take that's not exactly what you're saying. So how would Orthodox social thought land in a modern context? Or by modern context, I really mean Western context, United States.
Sure. No, yeah, that's a great question. So this gets into a distinction between the law and the gospel. And I have a whole section in the book. So the book has 5 parts. Maybe I'll start there. Part 1 is just, here's what the other Christians are saying. So we've already kind of discussed that. Part 2 is, what does the Bible say? We have a Bible. We should read it. We should know what it says. Part 3 is church history. Part 4 is modern economics. Part 5 is contemporary Orthodox contributions. So in the biblical section, I talk about the law. The law aims at justice. There's the law in the Bible, which is more than just a civil law, but it includes some civil law, and it's grounded in that natural law sort of morality. And an easy way to remember that is the silver rule, is what it's sometimes called. Do not do unto others as you would not have them do unto you. It's a sort of preventative or punitive sort of justice, right? That's what law is aimed at. The gospel is about mercy. Right, so justice is to give, to pay what is owed, right? To render to each what is due. Mercy is to do good even to those who have no claim on you. And mercy has to be free, right? It's not a matter of law. The law may prevent certain evils or evil effects of sin in the world, but it doesn't save us. It doesn't transform us into the people we were created to be. And so that's what asceticism is about. And that's not to say there was no asceticism in the Old Testament. There was all the kosher laws and that sort of thing.
Mm.
But
And you
that's
got prophets like Elijah and stuff,
yes,
to the extreme degree.
right. And it's also a condition where there wasn't, the society was less differentiated back then. So there's less religious liberty, in part because the nation and the church is not really a church back then, but the nation and religious community are kind of one and the same.
Yeah.
Whereas the early Christian apologists, again and again and again, only want religious liberty. Because they know there's a difference between God and Caesar. There's a difference between the kingdom of God and Rome, right? It's a different context. So, I'm all for asceticism, but asceticism, true Christian Orthodox asceticism, is free and freely chosen, even to the degree that, all the priests all the time make accommodations for people with dietary issues, or even if they're just new to the faith. It's like, okay, try being vegetarian. Don't go all out vegan yet, or whatever. Or, you go to a friend's house during Lent and they're like, here, we made you steak and we got wine. You eat the steak, you drink the wine, you get back to fasting the next day, because it's not about the fasting. It's a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. So yeah, a difference in the West would be my dad grew up Catholic, and for his youth, that was before Vatican II. And back then, if you didn't fast on a Friday, you'd have to go to confession, right? So it wasn't like the law of the land, but it was still very strictly enforced even within the canon law of the church. Whereas in the Orthodox Church, I guess if you were being sacrilegious about it or something like that, you should go to confession. But ordinarily, it's just, oh yeah, try again the next day.
Yeah, and I take a lot of the fasting rules are not just about you overcoming your passions, but also about training in the virtue of obedience, right? So there's a very direct tie between the particular fasting rules that you follow in your church and whoever the bishop of your church is, right? That it's also reminding you of that relationship and your willingness to subject yourself to another person's will, in this case, the bishop who represents Christ. Right?
And the priest who's their representative to your parish, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. One interesting thing is so the thinkers that you mentioned at the beginning, the various Catholic and Protestant thinkers that were answering the social question.
Yeah.
Right. They're all relatively new. They're all 19th, 20th century, right? So the question of why is there no Orthodox social thought? Some Orthodox might say, well, we're Orthodox. We don't come up with new ideas. We don't need new ideas, things like that.
Sure.
Right? So that's why there's no Orthodox social thought, because we're already consistent. We have everything we need, right? But some of the things that I've been looking into and researching, I don't know if you've read the book Law and Revolution by Harold Berman.
I have not.
It's one of my favorite books.
Okay.
It's definitely up your alley. I highly recommend it. It's about the history and development of Western law, basically.
Okay.
Mostly focusing on the Papal Revolution and its consequences in Europe. And he throughout the book, it's a fantastic book because it's really thorough history, but also very good commentary, even modern commentary, but also social scientific commentary about what does this mean about how we do social science, right? So he puts up he talks about and he's a lawyer. That's the field that he's in. He talks about what he's doing is beyond Marx, beyond Weber, right? And that the Weberian thinks that, well, you just have these groups and they have ideas. This is an oversimplification of Weber.
Sure.
They just have these ideas, these cultures, and they just operate according to the logic of their culture and their beliefs. And that's how you get various economic, social, political outcomes, right?
Yeah.
Whereas the Marxist thinks, well, there's various material conditions, various practical problems that are in front of you, and these dictate the kind of ideas that you have. So the economy is the engine of the car, and your ideology is the paint job, or something like that.
Yes.
And so what he says is, I'm operating beyond Marx, beyond Weber, right? In that clearly you can see the intellectual, ideological, or even spiritual, mystical thread throughout this whole Western legal tradition, and you can see a consistency, kind of a spirit of the law, but the practical individual laws that develop that are related to the questions that they're asking, the practical questions that they're confronted with, right? So in the sense that the Orthodox world in the 19th century was largely in Russia, Greece, and the Ottoman Empire at the time, they're not confronted with that same social question.
Right. I mean, Russia only began to industrialize towards the end of the 19th century. Even when the Russian Revolution came about, they'd barely started, right? It's a very different context. But even so, there actually are, parallel thinkers in the Orthodox Church. We just they're in my book, but they're not talked
Yeah.
about as often. So I'm sure
I
we'll
guess
get to that maybe in a minute.
Bulgakov would be one of them
Yep.
probably, right?
Yeah, Father Sergei Bulgakov. I don't know how to pronounce it.
Yeah.
One of those ways. Vladimir Solovyov before him in the
Right.
19th century. He had a whole section on economics in his book, The Justification of the Good. People
Right.
like S.L. Frank. And actually, what do you find there? What's interesting to me, what kind of got me going, reading Solovyov, he talks about economy as a realm of society. So he's like
Mm.
a similar sort of thinker who's trying to grapple with this new reality. And he pairs it up with, okay, what's our moral responsibility when it comes to our material resources? Asceticism. That's his answer. I
Mhm.
think he's a bit limited in his understanding of asceticism. I don't think it's actually exclusively material or exclusively about that negative side to it. As I said, it's more of this bigger spiritual practice and process. But that got me thinking, and that really was inspirational for me. And then someone like S.L. Frank and other Russian thinkers too, they talked about sobornost, which is
Yeah.
this word derived from the Old Slavonic of the Nicene Creed, the part where it says that I believe in one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. The word for
Mm.
Catholic is the same root as sobornost. So when they're trying to deal with, okay, what do we do about this modern reality? They're actually digging deep within holy tradition. So it's a new condition. It's a new reality that we have to engage, but we actually have some great tools within our tradition, and we actually have contemporary thinkers. Another one would be Saint Maria Skobtsova. She talks
Mm.
about sobornost as well.
She's the one that was a nun in France or in Paris.
Yes, yeah, in Paris, and then she was, she and some others ended up being arrested by the SS for sheltering Jews, and she died in Ravensbrück concentration
Mm.
camp, I believe, only a week or two before it was liberated.
Wow.
According to some accounts, she actually took the place of a woman in line going to the gas chambers. But a very, very saintly woman, but also a theologian. And some really amazing short essays that she wrote have been collected in a little book that I've drawn from as well. So I could go on and on about that sort of thing. But yeah, I mean, there are some who say that, and I think what their misunderstanding is, we don't want theological like innovation, right? Like the fathers are against innovation. And what they mean by that is we don't need something new other than Christ. What we want is to defend, our dogma are entirely about preserving that reality of the incarnation, that God became man in Jesus Christ. So you have all the ecumenical councils are about that. And what this perspective that I'm drawing from our holy tradition does is it takes that reality and then applies it to our economic life and
Hmm.
applies it to the question of how do we care for the poor, and what do we do with riches, and how do we handle profit and business and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And so I I hear that, but I think that also people know that when certain practical directions, I guess, if you want to pin it down to something, so when certain practical directions change over time, sometimes that has been done in a way that is out of step with tradition or
Sure,
is actually introducing a novelty.
sure.
So from the layperson's perspective, it's very hard to monitor, I guess, in to use econ language, the principal agent problem between the lay people and the bishop who is guiding them, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Because the bishops might in collective say, well, we're doing this because we're addressing a new problem, so we have to slightly change the directions that we're giving you for fasting or this or that, right?
yeah.
And you might go, okay, well, great, you're just following the spirit of the law, changing the letter, great, good for you. Or you might go, hey, maybe you're introducing some other spirit into the law, which is so spirits are very hard to monitor,
Right.
basically, is what I'm saying.
Right. And one thing that might be frustrating for, curious Westerners is that we're pretty comfortable with some ambiguity in the East, so even though the way in which we do like church authority is conciliar, and that's not just, okay, you have to have an ecumenical council. For a council to be considered ecumenical, it has to be accepted by all the people and accepted over time. So in the fourth century, there weren't just like two councils that happened. there were like dozens and dozens of councils. There's just only two that we regard as ecumenical because they actually withstood the test of time and were accepted by the people. And I
And
think
then
it'd go
there are
this.
some that are not considered ecumenical, but they're basically kind of accepted.
Yeah, they're still important, right? Or their
Yeah.
canons are still important, and yeah, and so I think it'd be the same way with any sort of change in practice or that kind of thing. Is we see it starting. Sometimes we have had one or two statements from either patriarchates or a few pan-Orthodox gatherings of bishops, but we've actually had a lot more writing on the more lay and priestly theological level, and I'm actually kind of okay with that. I think that there might be some benefit to some official guidance, but these are still very new questions in the scope of history, and it's very easy when you try to get into the details of economics. It's so different than what the world the church fathers lived in, for example. It's very easy to say something that just is simply like factually incorrect or economically imprudent or genuinely harmful. That it's good to actually, I think, have some caution when it comes to official statements, and hopefully encourage, and I hope my book encourages more lay people, more priests, professors, that sort of thing, to really dig into this and start doing the work that would be needed to set up a good foundation for any kind of responsible official statement someday. So I think we're kind of more at that level of things, and that's sort of exciting, but it also means that, as we started, a lot of people don't really have an answer to the question, what is Orthodox social thought? Because we don't even know where to start. Who do we read? Where do we go for that? So again, I hope my book will point people in the right direction.
Yeah, okay. And so tying these two things together a little bit, what we were talking about asceticism and this issue is with a lot of what I've worked on is monastics and this issue of trust. So
Yes.
the it's becoming for I guess I'm a part of this convert wave that people talk about, right, into Orthodoxy right now. And a lot of people are very attracted to Orthodoxy because of the monastic tradition,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And so there may be some role in the future, I don't know, and it would be interesting to look at the past maybe 100, 200 years and look at various controversies in these various shifts in the Orthodox world and what monastics had to say about them. So
Mhm.
Mount Athos, for example, is kind of the most stalwart, independent, well-known monastic community, such that someone when something happens in the church, someone says, "Well, what did Athos comment on that?"
Right. Right.
know?
Yeah.
So I wonder how that's going to play into as the Orthodox world is entering into the modern world more. To what degree are monastics going to be a part of negotiating that transition? Because I'm sure you're familiar with or you've heard of Peter Brown, the historian of late
Yes.
antiquity.
Hmm.
Yeah, he's a huge influence on me, and one of the things he talks about, one of his books from the early 90s, he talks explicitly about monastics playing this very important role, helping people negotiate between the good and bad parts of their paganism as they're converting to
Mm.
Christianity,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and their paganism here can be relatively benign things like which video games they're playing or something like that,
Sure.
right?
Right.
But monastics, as these people who, because of their asceticism and because they're taking on a higher degree of asceticism than everyone else, and they're volunteering into that position, sort of can they develop this remoteness and this ability to that people believe that they're not influenced by outside spirits more so, right?
Yeah.
Such that they can solve that trust issue a little bit better.
Yeah, and I actually I end the book with an epilogue that includes a section on how I really hope we see more urban monasticism
Uh,
in the West. So it's something that I visited Bucharest, I visited Athens and Thessaloniki, and it's great that like you can just see a monk walking down the street, right? We have some amazing monasteries here in the United States, but they tend to all be rural and kind of eremitic and following that Mount Athos sort of model, which I don't think is bad at all. It's not a criticism of that. But I wish we had a complementary component of the kind of St. Basil model. St. Basil said we need
yeah.
monks in the heart of our cities because that's where the neighbors are to love, right?
Yeah.
And he built his complex, the Basiliad, which was the first hospital, and it was staffed by monks and clergy, and there were doctors, but there was also spiritual care happening at the same time. And you could talk about historically universities often began with monastic brotherhoods, both East and West.
Hmm.
So they're a huge cultural force. And I have a whole chapter in the book on their economic force. They were responsible for huge enterprises sometimes. Even from the very beginning, the Desert Fathers owned boats and shipped goods up and down the Nile. I mean, it's not that they weren't living simply, but monastic poverty was more about self-sufficiency, and they all believed that they needed to work and make a profit so that they could give, right? Because Christians are supposed to be giving, loving, charitable people. So it's not quite as simple of a story as, oh, they sold everything, they abandoned everything, and then they were just poor living out in the desert. Well, they were poor living out in the desert. They did sell everything, but then they started making money so that they could give. And because they did that, they became this incredibly important civilizational, cultural, economic force. And I chart that. So you mentioned Max Weber earlier.
Hmm.
I chart that as sort of a response to Max Weber, as well as Adolf von Harnack, the church historian of the 19th century, both of whom just kind of dismiss Eastern monasticism. They say, well, we know in the West this was important, but in the East they're just a bunch of
Yeah.
navel-gazing mystics, and they never did anything important. And basically they didn't open a book. They did no research
Or they
because
didn't have one.
yeah,
They didn't
maybe.
have one.
I've been told at least both of them had some Eastern
Yeah.
connections and probably could have done their homework, but they didn't. But I mean, you look at it and it's just all through the generations, through different regions, whether it's in Byzantium, in the Middle East, in Kiev and the Rus and Russia, all again and again and again monasteries are an economic force.
Mhm.
I mean, a really interesting East-West difference is in the Middle Ages, there are no guilds in the East. So, like, the monasteries dominate the markets. Like, a lot of the markets are located at a monastery, right? It's so inseparable. And
Well, that happens in the West as well, but particularly like during the Merovingian period or the pre-Carolingian,
mm,
kind of in between them. The
yeah,
monasteries were some of the only places that,
yes,
maybe even certain Aryan barbarians would not dare, cross the wall. So they could serve basically as courts, as money exchange places and stuff like that, places that it was safe to trade at.
yeah.
So a lot of merchant activity surrounded monasteries in that time.
So
Yeah.
I got a whole chapter on the fall of Rome in the West as well
Yeah.
that touches on this, that churches and monasteries were sanctuaries. So
Mhm.
there's kind of Rod Dreyer. Some people might know of him. He talks about the Benedict option, and I think he's well intended, but it's really not based in real history. The real story is far more complex. And one of the things we see is the barbarians were hired to come fight wars for warring factions within the West. So that it wasn't like they invaded exactly. It was that, hey, if you come and you beat my enemy, I'll give you Spain or what. Like, I mean,
Yeah.
that's like the sort of thing that was happening. Peter Brown talks about this. You have like Jerome and Augustine. They all document this idea that the Arians, because they were a form of heretical Christians, basically kind of high church Jehovah's Witnesses for people who
Hmm.
want a short version of it, they wouldn't go into the churches. In fact, if anybody fled to the church, they would leave them alone, including pagans. It was a safe haven.
Hmm.
And it remained that way, as you said, through the Merovingian era and up to the Carolingian era, and then the barbarians suddenly are all pagans, right? So like the Vikings look at monasteries like banks. So like they are ransacking monasteries like
Yeah.
bank robbers, right? Because people were leaving their valuables in the monasteries because they were safe. Because nobody would go into a monastery and steal everything because everybody was some kind of Christian. And it's only when you get these kind of pagan barbarians that suddenly there's no respect for that.
Yeah. So one thing that this is exactly where I wanted to go next. So
Oh, good.
there's one thing that I've been working on that I'm still sort of working through theorizing a little bit, but I'm working with a little bit of data on it. To the pattern that kind of happens in the West, and it's unclear to me how much this has to do with the schism or not, is that you would get this a certain monastic order that develops, right?
Hmm.
And I have a sort of theory of why in the West monasticism organizes itself into orders and according to consistent rules. And it's basically because there are all kinds of different fragmented polities, right? Whereas in the West or in the East, you remain relatively unified, whether under a Christian empire or a Muslim empire, right?
Yeah.
You're in a place where violence capacity is relatively organized, right?
Hmm.
Whereas in the West, it's unclear if a barbarian or a Viking or a lord is going to, or the rival lord is going to come and attack this monastery, right?
Yeah.
So monasteries in the West are hyper dependent on protection from their local lord or their patron or something like that, right? So it's
Right.
much harder in the West, even if they're economically self-sufficient, or to say that they're materially independent because they're dependent on some lord for their protection, right?
Sure. Right.
So what the way that the monasteries sort of broadcast or advertise or ensure to pilgrims or bishops or other Christians visiting them that they are remaining independent of this Lord on whom they're dependent is that they adhere to a very strict rule that's consistent and practical. Like, so St. Benedict's rule really takes over because it really has that character as opposed to the other rules in the environment at the time, right? It's precise. It describes exactly when you go to liturgy. It describes exactly how you deal with foreigners and stuff like that. So it's a strategy responding to a fragmented polity, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, I would go beyond Benedict's rule, but certainly that's one reason for it. The rule of Saint Columbanus was equally popular, and should be noted that Celtic influence as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it especially the Celts, when they evangelized Ireland, starting with Saint Patrick, and then Scotland, and then they start sending missionaries to Western Europe to evangelize these Arians. Their like monasteries were even over the bishop sometimes in Ireland because it was so
Yeah.
rural. You started this monastery, and that was just the center of the church wherever you went.
Yeah.
And so you have all these monastic rules, which are much broader than here's how we monks are going to behave. It's here's how to have an ordered community,
Mm.
right? So there's stuff about like what to do about theft of property that wouldn't be a concern for St. John Cassian because all of his monks don't own anything, right? But even if the monks didn't own anything, although of course they still had monastery, they had collective ownership, that sort of thing. But even if they didn't own anything, they were over a whole community. And so they had to deal with things like, what do you do about private property? And I think Benedict is trying to be a bit more moderate than Cassian in his rule. And it eventually catches on because of that practicality. It's really with the Carolingian reforms and Benedict of Anian.
Yeah.
The rule of Saint Benedict is kind of becomes this standard that he wants to spread, but he also does incorporate stuff from Columbanus and some of these others. And the monastery at Nursia was eventually, even before this, was only revived by English missionaries who were following this Celtic model. It had completely fallen into disuse, I can't think of the right word I'm thinking, but it was almost kind of barren, right? So it's because of the Celts that we even got the rule of St. Benedict back. That's why I think that kind of Benedict option narrative isn't quite accurate, because it was actually these really outgoing, socially engaged monks who were changing the West, not the people who were just sitting in their monastery doing their prayers, which, just to be clear, I'm totally okay with people sitting in their monastery and doing their prayers, but that's just not how the history happened.
Yeah, so the way that I read like people like Benedict of Anian, and I understand that is since Benedict of Anian is operating specifically closely with I guess it's Louis the Pious, who's Charlemagne's son or grandson, and since they're operating much more closely with a royal figure, there's much more of this suspicion that maybe these monasteries are actually just the puppets of Charlemagne or something like that. Right?
Yeah.
So you really
Right.
need to hold to this strict, extremely consistent standard. And the same thing ends up happening in the 10th century with Edgar the Great, I think, right?
Mm.
Where also he has this thing called the Regularis Concordia, where all of the new what's sometimes called the monastic revival of the 10th century in England is also very much a Benedictine revival, right?
Mm.
So as the king, as a founder of monasteries, becomes much more prominent, the Benedictine rule is much more adhered to, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then what happens soon after is, well, but still this king and monastery relationship is very ambiguous to people.
Right.
So the thing that becomes extremely popular is not just adhering to a strict rule, but monasteries being members of an order which has an international character, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
that the monasteries are almost part of a franchise. Like the first major one is Cluny, right?
Yes. I
And
was going to
then
mention that. Yeah.
and then soon after the Cistercians, right?
Yep.
And then
And
the Premonstratensians or whatever.
they're able to be international in part due to their direct subordination to the Pope. So it's
Yes,
also
that's
tied to the
true.
rise of the
Yeah,
papacy as
yeah,
well.
exactly.
And I believe it was Cluny where, like, there, I don't want to, talk too bad about about people, but they were pretty shady. They were known for forging documents. Like most people think the donation of Constantine, I believe it's
Really?
Cluny. I hope I'm not confusing it with a different monastery. I have the right one in my book, but I don't have my book in front of me because it's not published yet. But they also like stole the relics of Saint Benedict as well, like just for the clout, like I mean, just like all kinds of like, whoa, this is getting shady sort of stuff going down. But yeah, it's a really fascinating story, and I put it in my book because until the Great Schism, technically any of these saints are our saints, and we need to know this story. So you even find feudal society is, in a sense, a product of Christian social thought in the West. You end up with this concept of three orders, where you have those who fight, that's the kings and the barons, those who pray, that's the monks and the clergy, and then those who work, which is everyone else, right? And it comes from, originally you had, again, these Celtic penitential manuals saying, well, if you do X, you need to do this kind of penance. In fact, the sacrament of confession, as we experience it today, even in the Orthodox Church, the kind of one-on-one with an elder, derives from the ancient Celtic Church, and it comes from this kind of practice. But their concept was more medicinal, right? This is for the healing of the soul. By the time you get to the feudal era, it's transactional, to the point where you can have a division of labor. So you go out and kill, we'll do the penance, right? That's kind of what happens. And then that, down the line, that even becomes, certain saints have earned so much extra merit, you get the whole indulgence thing grows out of that. So it's kind of a bad example of Christian social thought, but it is an example of Christian social thought really mattering in how a whole society engages with wealth and poverty and order. And then you get other challenges to that, which you could probably speak more about than me, but you get like the martial monastic orders, like the Templars, which are combining fighting and praying, right? Yeah. In a sense, maybe they're trying to heal that division. That might be a very charitable way of putting it, but they at least challenge that paradigm. Then later on, you get the rise of guilds. And that's, again, kind of somewhat comparable even to what happens in the industrial era, where there's just this new class or realm of society that just doesn't fit into the boxes that Christians have been dealing with, and it ends up kind of being a lead up to the radical changes of the modern era.
Well, this is another reason for you to read Berman, because what he is trying to do is trying to understand the history of Western law by the translation of these penitentials from medicinal documents into more transactional.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, right? Send me a link, and maybe we'll put one in your show notes too for listeners.
Yes, yeah. Well, we actually did a couple of years ago with some friends, a reading group. We read through this book and put it on YouTube on this channel.
Oh, so, cool. Well, there you go. Yeah.
So, but the other thing that I wanted to say about the monastic orders is the pattern that sort of develops is, so you're right to say that monastics were economic, in that they engaged in market activity, and that was one of the ways that they remained self-sufficient, such that they could perform their asceticism in safety, right? But also so that they could speak with independence and impartiality with respect to the rest of the church, right? And but the cycle that seems to happen in the West is you get an order that's extremely successful. They have a lot of land, they have a lot of wealth, and then they get really good at making wealth, and they become some of the wealthiest people in Europe, which is, even if in their hearts they're, acting as ascetics, sometimes they're not, but even if in their hearts they're acting as ascetics, this is, it's at least an oxymoron.
The Cistercians, I think, are the kind of the poster children for this. It was known as the embarrassment of riches, right?
Yes.
We actually see this in the Christian East as well. So I talk about the monks at Solovki, which later became like the Gulag, but in, I believe, the 17th century, the early 17th century, it was originally founded maybe late 16th century by a Metropolitan St. Philip of Moscow. And he was a very saintly figure, but he founded these salt works and very enterprising as well at the monastery. And then what happens is in the early 17th century, you have the time of troubles, which is like 15 very terrible years. But salt is like white gold It's like the oil or petroleum of its time, and these monks got a lot of it. And so there's an economist, Nathan Smith. I don't know if he ever published this paper, but he had a working
Yeah.
paper that I've drawn from where he talks about how there's a certain cycle of monastic decay and renewal, and it's equally true in the East as in the West, that you have someone who they're kind of disenchanted by the secular world, or even the Christian world, but secular in that sense of just the everyday world. And so they say, I'm going to go out and I'm going to just live according to Christian ideals. I'm going to be pure, right? So someone like Saint Anthony, right? I'm just going to go out to the edge of the city. What happens? People hear about him. So he's like, oh, this isn't what I want. And everybody wants him to pray for them. He's like, I'm going to go to that abandoned fortress in the middle of the desert. He does that. They're still coming out, knocking on the door. Abba Anthony, pray for me, whatever. End of his life, he's on the top of a mountain. People are still climbing the mountain to see him. But what ends up happening, according to St. Athanasius, is the desert became a city, because so many monks follow his example. So these people inspire others to do the same thing, and they build what he calls spiritual capital. It's this kind of the product of asceticism and of living this life of prayer and of the sacraments, and actually growing in communion with God. It's attractive and it's self-perpetuating. But unfortunately, at the same time, they do build wealth, right? It's a byproduct of their way of life. If you consume very little, but labor is a spiritual discipline, and production is virtuous to the extent that you're giving to the poor, well, suddenly you end up with this abundance. And then what happens? When times get rough, there are people who would even take a vow of celibacy to not be starving, right? And that's, I think, what you see at Slovki during the time of troubles. You see people just not wanting to starve. So they join this monastery. And what's amazing is like the vast majority of written documents from monasteries in this era are like accounting records. And so we actually know how little they set aside for alms during this time. They had like massive, like what would be equivalent to multi-million-dollar profits, and it's like $20 for the year, So it can be kind of disheartening, but it serves as a warning as well. So I don't, for any listeners wondering if, maybe we're too romantic or idealistic about romanticism, no. Monks will be the first to tell you they are equally tempted by sin, if not more so. But they're fighting this fight to be examples for us. That's what I think is admirable about it. Sometimes, unfortunately, they're bad examples, but we can learn from that too.
So that pattern is what the economist Abner Greif would call a self-undermining equilibrium, in that the practice of monasticism creates a condition that over time undermines its possibility. So it has to go further out. But what I've noticed is maybe a difference between Eastern and Western monasticism is, so someone like St. Anthony, since he's not part of a monastic order and he's not beholden to a particular bishop or order or abbot or master of the order somewhere else, when things get a little bit too hot around him, he can move, well, in the desert it's a little bit different, but when things get a little bit too concentrated around him, he can move further out into the desert, right? And in Bulgakov's article that you published in your journal, he says something very similar about the Russian monastics.
That's right. Yep.
But in the West, when I've dedicated to an order, I've almost fixed myself at a certain point. Because by committing to this order and by committing to this very particular practice, I've enmeshed myself in a certain spot. So as nobles figure out ways to sneak through the rule, so with St. Benedict's rule, the particular hole was that there was no real regulation of which kind of people are accepted into the monastery.
That's right.
So by the end of the 11th century, almost the entire monastic population or Benedictine population is noble.
They're aristocrats. Right? Yeah.
And so the Cistercians are trying to correct this, right? So what you get in the West is this cycle of monastic orders, right? So that you have one rise and then it kind of maybe peters off, or it still stays where it's at, and then you have another one rises and it has all the reputation as the new frontier order. Right. So it's more colorful in a sense, in that different orders, different robes are showing up, and these are the new freshest robes of the most remote ascetic monks.
Right. Well, and as you mentioned, they also had these structures of international authority that you just don't really have in Eastern monasticism. You just have individual monasteries, usually on some person's estate, so they have like a patron, but it's not that like, oh, the monastery of the Holy Cross is subordinate to Mount Athos or whatever. No, for the most part, it's just its own thing. It's doing its thing, So yeah, you don't really have that kind of thing. So you still get a similar cycle of decay and reform, and some people either going out and starting their own thing or trying to reform within the monastery. But it's not at all comparable in that sense that you find in
Yeah.
the West with the different orders.
Yeah. Okay, well, you were mentioning a little bit about guilds and the growing merchant class in Europe. So let me shift a little bit to the topic of usury, which is something else that you talk about in the book.
Yeah.
And this
Hmm.
is kind of one of the hot topics. So I think we were talking about this. I think we were talking about this at one point, and you said this is one of the reasons that you wanted to write this chapter. Is one time I was at an event at church, and this guy learned I was an economist, and immediately his first question was, and this was in the middle of like someone else's talk. He asked me a question. He was like, "What do you think about usury?" And I was like, I don't know. It's bad.
Right.
Right. So, I think I said like, oh, well, usury is like by definition the wrong one, right? Like it's bad lending or something. So I was like, so by definition it's bad.
Yeah, sin is
And
bad.
afterwards he came up to me and he was like, so why is lending, positive interest basically? Why is that okay? And I was like, risk, and I gave all the standard economist answers, and he was like, oh, you're just a shill for the banks. I was like,
Yeah,
what?
yeah, yeah.
Where
Right.
did this come from? But it is a very hot topic, specifically among Catholics right now too.
Hmm.
So why don't you talk a little bit about that? Because it seems like one of those doctrines that is a little bit inconsistent over time, right?
Right.
Such that one might accuse one who is introducing it or one who is taking it away as, I don't know, capitulating to the world or accreting doctrine to capitulate to the world in some way.
Right, right. So if you read like only the church fathers, you'll be like, oh, they're just against lending at interest, right?
Yeah.
That would is a very reasonable conclusion that a lot of people have drawn, and I don't think that's even entirely wrong. But there's an important context to their preaching, and that is in basically every case. And I've read a lot of their preaching on this. They are against lending at interest to the poor, to people who have it. You couldn't be expected to pay it back in the first place. That's always an important moral context for what they're talking about. Now, they also live in a time that's very agrarian. There's a lot of poor. There's very few kind of middle class merchant tradespeople. So it's not as if they're seeing a lot of loans between business people. So they might be thinking these loans are just bad, right? Their statements might be as absolute as they sound, but it is a little foggier than people seem to think, in part because of that condition. Another one is occasionally they will actually define what they're talking about. So St. Augustine, for example, says that usury is to give less and expect more, right? That does sound like, okay, yeah, that's interest, right? But, put that in a modern context when we're aware of, in fact, some people even want, at least some low level of inflation year over year. So if I lend $100 and a year later someone pays me back $100, I've actually lent more and received less. That's the opposite of his definition, right? So it seems
the
like
other person would be the usurer, the borrower.
yes, exactly. In a sense, I mean, not quite as badly, but it still would be the inversion of what he's saying. So that tells me that okay, something's maybe at least a little different about our modern context. And then when you look at things like canon law, it complicates things further. So canon law prohibits lending interest to clergy. Again and again, it's clergy. So it's people with a personal spiritual relationship to their congregation. And I think even today, priests should not be lending at interest to their parishioners. I think that would be very bad because they have this personal connection with them. But then if you look at Eastern law, so you look at Justinian and even after him, pretty consistently, it's just they cap the rate of interest. They change the rate depending on the kind of loan here and there over time. There was one point in the East where they tried to ban all interest. It was a disaster, and it very quickly had to be overturned. And
merchant loans for overseas shipping, for example, were usually kept quite high because the risk of something like that is really high.
Right. And Byzantium was far more commercial than the West. The West was even more agrarian.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it depended on trade in a greater degree than in the West. And then so you can track this even into the early Slavs or the Rus. There's Saint Vladimir Monomakh, the grandson of Saint Vladimir, was called to be Prince of Kiev by the people to solve a crisis of usury. There were people lending, and it was it's not clear exactly how much, but it was like astronomical interest. It was very bad. So he comes in and we have a copy of the laws. Like we have this record. What law did he implement? Did he do away with all interest? No, he just capped the rate of interest. Right? He just brought it down to a reasonable level. And doesn't seem to be bothered by that. No chronicler. There's a lot of Russian chroniclers. No chroniclers are like, he was pretty good, but he didn't get rid of usury. Like, it just doesn't occur to anyone to even criticize him for it. And I think that's because nobody thought he did anything wrong. So there's a few distinctions that I think are important. But first, I'll talk about the West and why was it different. What was different in the West is, while in the East, they have this heritage of Greek philosophy, and they speak and read in Greek. In the West, it's kind of mixed. It's what do they get in Latin? And one of the things that they don't have much of in Latin for a long time is Aristotle. Mm-hmm. So when they finally get him through Muslims, who got them through Christians, who dominated the education profession in the Middle East for a long time, but they get Aristotle and they're like, wow, this is great, which Aristotle is great. Like, I'm sympathetic, but they're kind of just taking everything and seeing what they can do and seeing if they can Christianize it. And one thing they take is his definition of money. And he thinks that usury is unnatural because money doesn't reproduce itself. So it's not like a grain that you can put in the ground and get more than what you planted. It's just, it stays what it is. And so it's unnatural to expect more back. And when you get to the early scholastic era, or the late scholastic era, the early modern era, you have people dealing with the discovery of the Americas, all this influx of gold, which creates a huge crisis of inflation in the 16th and 17th century, but also this increase of trade. And so you have all these people that depend on loans for their business. Some of them are the moneylenders, but others are just, they're involved in one way or the other. But they're also pious Christian people. So they're going to like these Jesuit theologians for confession. And they're saying, what do I do? Right? They don't want to, they can't abandon their trade and impoverish their families, but they're lending at interest, or they're receiving, or they're borrowing at interest. And so one of the things they do is they start with Aristotle, and they have this problem that they actually don't seem to even care about the question of exploitation of the poor. That's how kind of sidetracked their analysis has gotten. And then they actually find all sorts of workarounds. So cases where, well, when could it be just? When would it not actually be usurious? And those are actually really fruitful and interesting, I think. And then eventually you get someone like John Calvin in the West who basically just says, like, no, of course money can be fruitful. like he just kind of gets the basic thing, like if you give someone money and then they make more money, they can pay you back more. And that's kind of like the Eastern view. I mean, it's weird to say that. I know a lot of listeners who are Orthodox might not like John Calvin. I have strong disagreements with him about icons, for example, and free will and other things, but kind of think he got that one right.
He loved saying things like, well, I don't listen to philosophers, I just read the Bible.
Yeah, right.
So there's a reason he's dismissing Aristotle too.
Yes, although his first book, before he even became a Protestant, was a commentary on Seneca's De Ira. So he did actually read philosophers, but he was rhetorically, he would make these overstatements, and yeah.
Well, I think this issue and this topic is a really good example of what I was talking about earlier as an issue that's, by its nature, when you look into it, clearly beyond Marx and beyond Weber. Right?
Absolutely.
In the sense that this question of changing merchant activity, the changing structure of the economy, is prompting new questions to the same people who are trying to answer it according to the same principles. So they come up with slightly different direct instructions or direct ideas, right?
Yeah.
So the Marxists will just look, oh, look, as the merchants developed, then the church changed their ideas so that they could, maintain a monopoly on this, right?
Right,
but
right.
The Bavarian would look at it and say, like, oh, well, Aristotle, they had their idea about Aristotle, and it's just a consistent line through, and then maybe there's a spiritual interruption, and then they change their idea. But it's clearly that these are being negotiated and teased out together. There's, of course, moments where there's a spiritual shift, right, independent of material shifts, but then there's also material shifts independent of spiritual shifts. So people look at this tradition and see inconsistency and find that as evidence of accretion or not orthodoxy, or whatever you want to call it, denying.
Right. Yeah, and it's the sort of thing that there is less writing on it in the East, although again you can find sources, but the context is so different, right? I mean, you don't have an influx of American gold in the 17th century in the East. What you have is and actually in the 15th century, the fall of Constantinople, right? I mean, it's just like radically different what people are experiencing. Moscow was doing well economically in the 16th and 17th centuries because they were actually fairly free trade oriented for their time anyway. But they're just very far removed from what's going on, and they have much different concerns and issues that they're dealing with. Yeah, and then I guess the last thing I tell people about usury, so I already mentioned inflation is one factor. The other one is just there's a difference between law and gospel. Again, gospel is about mercy, it's personal, right? So Christ can tell someone, hey, sell all you have, because that's what that person needed to hear. That's what some of us need to hear. Again, I'm pro-monasticism. Some of you should sell all you have and become monks. But it's not necessarily for everyone. Christ said some should become eunuchs for the kingdom of God, by which he meant celibate, not literal eunuchs. We had to settle that one historically too. But it would be oppressive to make that a law, right? To say nobody can get married anymore, right? That's not his point. That's confusing the law and the gospel to apply that way. And I think the same way when he talks about lending, he's talking about when you have a person, if your brother comes to you or your friend and they say, hey, I need help, you don't say, all right, now's my chance to make a profit, right? Like that is sinful. But if you're a business person, like in Christ's parables, you're a rich man and you want to, have your money taken care of. Well, if you're a steward, you go to the bank. You bring the rich man's money to the bank because the rich man can be expected to pay it back. The bank can be expected to pay it back. It's an entirely different context, and that matters. So there's that. And then I think the last thing is we have bankruptcy now, right? So you don't get thrown into debtor's prison. Your family doesn't get thrown into slavery if you can't pay a debt. For the most part, you can renegotiate your debts, pay back what you can, and be done with it. You'll have a bad credit score. Oh, that's the other thing. We have credit scores as well. So we don't lend to people with low expectation to pay it back. And, but there are, so then.
Rates are just lower across the board because of that stuff. Anyway.
Right. And so as not to be an apologist, actually a few years ago, co-wrote an essay, apologist for the status quo, I should say. I co-wrote an essay with Jim Catton, North Dakota State, also Orthodox and an economist, about student loans. I think student loans are usurious. They explicitly say we don't consider credit or risk or anything like that, and they're very, very hard to discharge in bankruptcy. So the two modern stops that or correctives that we have are not present when it comes to student loans. And there's all sorts of other reasons that people, a 17-year-old signing on the dotted line, I mean, they barely even understand this. Hopefully they've learned something in their high school, but anyway, I don't want to get into education and talking about that. But the point is, usury does still happen. It is still a sin, but it's important to actually be able to think through these things carefully. That's the point of Christian social thought, and that's the point of my book on Orthodox social thought, is to help us really untangle what are genuinely complicated issues. They're still genuinely important issues and genuinely moral issues, but they take maybe a little more thinking than just kind of, well, I read this church father or I read this Bible verse, and now I'm going to hit somebody over the head on Facebook with it.
Yeah. And I think people know that a lot of the issues that we're going to face in the coming decades, and that we've really probably had for the last 2 decades and have not properly addressed, right, are very difficult questions to answer. And they feel that the right response is to just pick a tradition and stick with it, and the tradition just has unambiguous, clear answers about all of this stuff. And then, well, one, usually it doesn't have unambiguous answers. But they think that if it does have ambiguous answers, that means it's not true, and you're denying the tradition.
Right.
It's a very complicated thing, and the real way that historically that's been negotiated and teased out is by having a lot of institutional trust, right? Which hopefully could get healed in various ways, right?
Right.
So we've been going for about an hour. I had one final question I wanted to ask you that is kind of open-ended, so you don't even need to have an answer, and you can freewheel about it, I guess, a little bit. Is I guess based on the other things I've been saying and the way I've been thinking about the way that the West developed, right? Because the West had many unique material experiences and political experiences that didn't dictate but influenced the way that its legal thinking and social thought developed, right?
Yeah.
As Orthodoxy starts to move into the West, or as more people in the West start to convert to Orthodoxy, how might that change the way that Orthodox organize themselves or think about these issues, right? So if you have permission to speculate for the next 100 years,
right.
Is,
Yeah, yeah.
particularly maybe in somewhere like America, where we have this very strange situation, which really is not ideal, where you have many different jurisdictions overlapping with one another.
Right.
How is that going to develop, do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question.
How
So
would you like it to develop, and how do you think maybe it actually will develop?
yeah, so I'm not a prophet nor the son of one, but
Okay.
there's a few things that I think are interesting. So um, the Orthodox Church came to the United States and the West in general in terms of immigrants and refugees, right? Where there's
Mhm.
people like you and me who wandered in, and I'm German and Scots, and so that's not my background. But that's where a lot of these parishes come from, and they retain a lot of features that we see of just immigrant communities in general in the United States, meaning that they usually assimilate pretty well and they thrive. So a lot of people might be coming from really rough backgrounds in Eastern Europe or the Middle East, and then they come here and they experience economic liberty and democracy. And what do you know? Like they like I mean, look at the Forbes top 100 and look for all the Greek names, or whatever. Like you could find a few. They're doing pretty well, and I think that that will have to influence how we approach some of these questions. The overlapping jurisdictions things, I don't have an answer for that, except that I hope we don't try to rush a solution. I know
Yeah.
people. I certainly think yes, it's abnormal. It's not the way it should be. On the other hand, like there are times where it that kind of measure seemed like the right thing to do, and it had the opposite effect. So, a historical example I would give would be the Metropolitan of Kiev was Metropolitan of Kiev and all the Rus. And eventually, Moscow became the dominant city among the Rus. So he moved there. He used to be Metropolitan of Moscow, Kiev, and all the Rus, right?
Mhm.
And then you have the fall of Constantinople. And really, technically they were this whole time they are under Constantinople as their patriarch.
Mhm.
They say, shouldn't we be independent? Shouldn't we just be able to run? Like de facto, we are running our own things. And so Moscow gets elevated to patriarchate. What that means in practice, though, is that now there is no, as you kind of mentioned with like the monasteries in the West, there's no higher international authority. And
Mhm.
so the struggle against the Tsar, like I believe almost right away, it's like Tsar Ivan the Terrible, who martyrs Metropolitan Philip. So actually not right away because he was still Metropolitan. So it must have been after. But still, like you have this struggle with the government becomes much harder to maintain a certain distance and purity because, you see the same thing with Roman Catholicism in non-Catholic countries. They tend to be very pro-liberty. Not to say anything about the Catholic countries, but like just in the American experience, because they're not totally tied. And it's the very thing that people worried about with Kennedy should have made them happy about him, right? Oh, he has another authority. Like that's actually a good thing. That means he's not going to just be beholden to domestic interests or something like that. And so in our current situation, we have all these overlapping jurisdictions. Yes, it's not the way it should be. But we do manage to do a lot of pan-Orthodox things. And different communities are finding their own localized solutions to adapting. Some of that's positive, some of that's negative, depending on your opinion, right? So we have, ROCOR has a reputation for the kind of extreme sort of conservative, traditionalist approach. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. It's not for me. I'm Greek Orthodox. But I think it's good that there's somebody doing that. And maybe it's easier for them to do that because they're ROCOR and they're not just part of an American Orthodox church that's trying to be standardized on a grand scale. So, yeah, I mean, and then the last thing I wanted to say, and I don't really confront the kind of like current modern day propaganda, but it does, I think, to me, constitute something of an answer to it. In the history of the church, you actually have a lot of democracy. In a lot of places, bishops were voted upon, and bishops were integrated into the constitution of Christian Rome. Like they were given the judiciary right. You could, if you were caught for a crime, you had a choice. You could go to the magistrate or the bishop,
Yeah.
if you're pleading guilty at least. And people, by and large, especially as time went on, they chose the bishop, right? So he's de facto kind of the government, for better and worse. But he's also like voted upon. Like this is, at least for a while, and so there's democracy is not a new thing in the East. And then one thing I highlight, which was just I can't believe I didn't know about it till a few years ago, but Novgorod and Pskov were
Yeah.
republics. Novgorod for 350 years. That's 100 years longer than the United States. It was a
Yeah.
republic, an Orthodox Christian republic. Everyone, the archbishop, the prince, they're voted on by the citizens, the Vechi, the Citizens Council, or Veche.
And
And
Saint Alexander Nevsky is one of the most famous
yes,
of the Novgorod. Yeah.
yep, yeah. He fought off the Swedish Crusade. Yeah, and so they would, if they didn't like a prince, they'd say, okay, thanks, bye. Like they had the power to do that.
Hmm.
So the idea that, okay, this Western context of, whether it's economic liberty or political liberty or democracy, that sort of thing, this is all foreign and non-Orthodox because it's in the West, I think is an error. That doesn't mean that it's all good, but we have our own experience of trade, enterprise, democracy within our church history. We just haven't been reading it. We haven't been actually looking it over. And so I hope part of what we'll see is tapping into some of those neglected sources again, too. Things like even the early Russian Empire, the first like 100 years or so, was a time of liberal reform. And sometimes that was bad, like straight up bad. Don't want to repeat it. But some of it was good. And there are thinkers at that time that are struggling with some of the same dominant ideas that are in our culture today. And we could actually probably learn a lot from them, even though a lot of times when Orthodox think about this period of history, they're like, oh, it was westernizing and bad. I think it's far more mixed than that.
Hmm.
And I think that it's at our own peril that we actually don't interact with these sources because we're not going to learn the lessons. We're not going to actually see, okay, what was a mistake and what wasn't. What was actually positive. There was a huge push for education and literacy that was very good, right? At the same time, there was a kind of anti-monastic streak that I think was very bad. And I could go on and on with details, but I think we have the resources in our tradition to really have something relevant to say. And I don't mean that in a cheap way of like trendy. I mean, genuinely giving people a genuine alternative that isn't just like an escape to an imagined past. We can live in a world today with spaceships and internet and be faithful Orthodox Christians in the same way that St. Ignatius was on the road to martyrdom in 110 AD. And I hope my book is at least a contribution towards helping us do that, specifically again with regards to economics, but hopefully throughout all of life.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess from the layperson's perspective, it's very hard to measure when you see a bishop or a priest or people in your church doing a particular thing, measuring in which direction they're moving or why they're acting in various ways or justifying it in various ways. So I think that hopefully your book and other people that are interested in these kind of issues are going to help give a little bit of clarity to that because they're tough nuts to crack, and it
Right.
requires like a lot of history and a lot of perspective and a lot of sort of just very basic analysis, but also just sort of looking back and looking at the big picture and trying to understand how all these pieces fit together to actually understand how to distinguish one thing from another as you're entering into new foreign territory. That is the future in a way, new technologies, new ways of speaking to one another, new ways of interacting. So yeah,
Right.
thanks, Dylan. This was fantastic, and
Thank you, Marcus.
I'm looking forward to reading the book.
Great. Thank you so much.